Welcome everybody. Happy MAGFest 2023. Thank you guys all so much for coming to this talk, which I've titled Going with the Flow, discussing relationships between music and player immersion. So we're basically going to unpack the question of what is it about a video game that draws us in, gets us hooked, gets us immersed, really makes us keep playing and playing and playing for hours and hours at a time, and how, if at all, does the music work to achieve that? That's going to be we might not answer that question by the end of the presentation, but we're definitely going to think a lot about it. So a bit about me. My name is John McNamara. I'm currently a PhD student at Georgia Tech, so I live in Atlanta, Georgia. And this is my fourth MAGFest, but this is the first time I've actually given a panel at one. Basically, 4 years ago, I was sad because my boyfriend was out of town, and my friend texted me, or I texted my friend hey, what are you doing? And he's like, I'm at MAGFest, come. And then a breakup, a pandemic, and a master's degree later, here I am. Now I'm working on my PhD. So basically the plan, I'm going to talk a bit about what my lab at Georgia Tech does, and then talk about my work specifically, how that fits together, how that fits into the theme of this convention. And then a little bit, not going to spend too much time on this, but talk about two studies that I've been working on. One was a playtest experiment that I did for my master's completion project, and then the second one is a survey that I'm working on right now, and I'm going to invite you all to participate in at the very end. So my degree, my master's degree and my PhD are, the name on the piece of paper is music technology. And when I tell that, or when I first told that to my aunts and uncles at Thanksgiving, they were like, so you're going to be a DJ? And I was like, no. That'd be cool. But what I'm doing is pretty cool as well. So it's less about electronic music and making electronic music, although I do a little bit of that as a hobby. But it's more the academic study of the intersection between music and engineering, computer science, and psychology. So these are all, well, except for the psychology part, these first two screenshots are from the Georgia Tech music department website. So we've got more on the engineering side. We've got a whole robotic musicianship lab where there are people who build robots that can play music. So this robot's name is Shimon. Shimon can play the marimba, and that's Shimon in action right there. On the computer science side, we have folks who are working on integrating computer science education and music education, so that by teaching music, you're also teaching computer science and vice versa. The main tool that we've got with that is this program called EarSketch. Has anyone ever heard of this before? Okay. Well, it's used in a lot of middle school and high schools as a computer science teaching tool, mostly in Georgia. So if you're not from Georgia or you don't live in Georgia, I understand. But they just hit their millionth user not too long ago, so they're very proud of that. But basically, you can learn how to write code in either Python or JavaScript, and the functions that you're working on to learn programming skills ultimately produce a remix of a song. And then finally, psychology. So we spend a lot of time understanding how the human brain works, how the human ear works, and how it processes music. Because a really important idea of when you're engineering musical applications, you're engineering them for people. And so at the end of the day, you have to understand how people's minds work and how they're actually going to hear the thing that you're making. And that actually factors a lot into engineering decisions that you make for these applications. So one example is, the human ear can only hear a certain range of frequencies. If you start, play a pitch and then you make it higher and higher and higher and higher, eventually you're not going to hear it. And that constraint actually governs how much data and how much memory audio applications allot toward generating the sound. Because there's basically a minimum amount of data that you need in order to capture all of those frequencies. And so you don't want to go beyond that because we're not going to hear it anyway, but you also don't want to go less than that because you want to make sure you're capturing the full spectrum of human hearing. So that's just one example of why Psychology is important. I mentioned that when I talked about my degree, and people were like, huh, psychology? That's not technology, but it's very important because we're ultimately building things for people. So I don't really do so much stuff on the physical engineering side. I do more stuff in the computer science and the psychology domain, which I'll go into that in a second. So the name of my lab is called the Cognitive and Computational Musicology Lab, because names at academic institutions of labs have to sound fancy and important. But basically what that means is that the people in my group are basically interested in understanding the relationship between musical structures and human psychology. So when I hear a piece of music, when I hear a melody, when I hear a chord progression, when I hear a drum beat, why do I react to it the way that I do? Why does my favorite song get me out of bed in the morning when I have it as my, or why does this like annoying alarm clock sound get me out of bed in the morning if it's not your favorite song? One thing that is actually an active area of like research and understanding is, why do we listen to sad music? Like, why do we enjoy sad music? Like, why when people describe some of their favorite pieces, they're like, oh, I love this piece, it makes me cry every time I listen to it. Why do you want to cry? That doesn't make any sense. But I would think that a lot of you can think of a piece of music that you really, really love that makes you cry. Think of like the score for every Pixar movie. So that's kind of an interesting question that people are working to understand. But also things like, how does music help you focus when you're studying? What's the best type of music for that? What instruments, what tempi, what, any fancy like mixing techniques. And basically to answer these types of questions, how does music impact human psychology? There are two strategies that you can go about tackling these kinds of problems. One is looking at just the raw audio file. So if I take my favorite song, load it into Audacity, or just analyze the waveform that comes out on the speaker as I'm playing it, like looking at that data specifically and the information that it contains. And there's one lab at Georgia Tech that focuses on that approach. My lab takes another approach and looks at the musical symbols. So we don't care so much about the actual audio, although sometimes we'll compare the two. We're more interested in the musical notation. So looking at things like phrases, notes and rhythms, contours, dynamics, harmonies, things like that, which the way that you analyze that data is completely different from the way that you analyze just the raw audio data. And so the way that we go about doing that is basically if there's like a question about, say, a genre of music, like we're interested in saying like, why are Beatles songs more popular than Led Zeppelin songs or something, I don't know. We would gather as much musical data in like a score format as we possibly could. So we'd gather as many Beatles transcriptions as we could, and we'd gather as many Led Zeppelin transcriptions as we could. And we compile that into what we call a corpus of music. So we have all of these like musical scores. You can imagine it's like piles and piles and piles of sheet music all over the lab. Oh, that'd be nice, very aesthetic, but that's unfortunately not how it works, because basically in order to do analysis to it efficiently, we have to convert this music into a format that a computer can understand. A lot of traditional musicology is focused on, it takes like a very humanities approach, where you look at a score and you notate it by hand and you make judgments about the notes and the rhythms and the harmonies based on kind of your opinions. But we take a more data science approach. And so we need to convert these corpora, into formats that the computer can read before we run our analysis. So here's an example of kind of what that looks like in practice. Does anybody recognize this piece of music just by looking at it? Yes?
It's the Star Wars theme.
Yes, correct. It's the main theme from Star Wars. So if, for instance, hypothetically, we were interested in running some kind of musicological analysis on Star Wars music, we would have to convert this into this. This is also the Star Wars theme. It just looks completely different. But basically, we've taken this musical score and converted it into something that is easier for the computer to understand. So all of the information about the key signature, the time signature, and the tempo, that's all encoded in this text file up here at the top. And then each kind of piece of information that we care about with the music we put in a specific column. So this column right here is the melody for Star Wars. The 12 means that it's a 8th note triplet. The F means that it's playing the pitch F. And then the L's and the J's are about, notation type things. The 1 B minus means that it's a B flat whole note, and you can keep going and going. Multiple C's and E's mean that helps specify which octave it is in. So we've taken a very systematic approach from turning that piece of sheet music into something the computer can read. And then additionally, we have additional columns that we've paired with the melody. This one mostly has harmony information. There's some other stuff about like pedals and cadences, but there isn't any of that in the screenshot. And then we do fancy schmancy data science stuff to it. So now that this is basically a table, it's a TSV file essentially, so you can load that into Python or R and do whatever you want to it from there. So this was something that I was working on last year, creating this corpus for all of the themes from Star Wars. So we had, my advisor and I were working with a researcher from Tufts who has on his website done kind of a conventional musicology analysis of all of the themes from Star Wars. And she found it and was like, hey, let's put, so he had them all, like this. And then my advisor was like, let's put them all like this, and then we can publish a paper about it. And then if people are interested in Star Wars, they can, do whatever they want with this data. And so I don't want to go through all the data because this paper hasn't been published yet. But now, if you were ever curious about big picture patterns in the themes from Star Wars, you could download our corpus and play around with it and answer, some kinds of questions. So, what's the range that John Williams uses when he's writing his melodies? Well, he has a pretty wide range. He goes from B1 to F sharp 6. So it's 5.5 octaves that he uses when writing melodies. He tends to use more minor chords than major chords. And kind of the mean pitch is a B3. It's not quite a symmetrical distribution. If you actually look at the graph, kind of the tail for the low notes is much longer than it is for the high notes. But you would have never, I don't know. Again, these may be very, very niche curiosities for some people, but then, you can then take that and then, have people watch Star Wars and kind of understand their reactions to certain themes and maybe compare this to this data and draw some conclusions about maybe how Star Wars works based on kind of a more quantitative analysis than if you were to just, I looked at the score and wrote my opinions, and I love conventional musicologists, and it's a very interdisciplinary field. I don't mean to throw shade. This is just kind of another way of approaching these problems. So often, so that's the computational side of our lab, and then we also combine this data with perceptual studies. So like I alluded to, often once we have a corpus, we'll do a study where we have people listen to the actual music and then observe something about their psychological response to it. So this may be physiological. So my advisor just did a study on frisson, which is if you listen to music and get chills and goosebumps, that's what that phenomenon is. So trying to understand kind of what, she was looking mostly at harmony, so what chord progressions are most likely to elicit that response. But it could also be just like a survey. So you listen to a piece of music and we ask you some questions about it, or I just did one, or I helped with a study where folks listened to pop music that we had put in that TSV format that I showed earlier, and we basically asked them, how happy or sad do you think this piece of music is, and how high or low energy do you think this music is? And basically by asking those two questions, you can plot like how happy or sad they think it is, which is called valence, and how high or low energy, which is called arousal. And most emotions can be plotted somewhere on this axis. And so you can then from that data say like, oh, this is a piece of like depressing sounding music, or oh, this introduction sounds very, tense, but then it becomes happy in the chorus. And this is consistent across multiple listeners. So what is this composer doing to elicit that emotional response? And you guys might be like, okay, John, this is nice, but I'm at MAGFest. Stop talking about Star Wars. That's for another convention. I'm here to talk about video games. What does this have to do with video games? So you may have heard the term musicology. So that's basically just the academic study of video game music. So who here has felt a very strong emotion whenever they've played a video game? Could be joy, sadness, rage, depending on what you're playing. Probably most of you, if you're at a video game convention. And how many people believe that this emotional response was due in part to what was going on in the music? Again, pretty much everybody. So, I don't know, maybe I may be weird, I may be the only person who asks these questions, but that happens to me all the time too, and I'm just like, how did that composer do that? Dang, that's awesome. I love this game, or I love this composer. How did they make me feel all of these feels? I want to know their secrets. And there's been a lot of research on music's role in film for helping create emotional responses to films as folks watch them, but there's been very little in video games. And often kind of the approach that folks take when kind of analyzing film or analyzing video game music, I think is just because video games are like a relatively new medium compared to film and television. They do it based on kind of practices that people do for studying films. But that doesn't always work super well. One, because just like the way that music is composed is completely different. And what's I think is more important, there's this element of interactivity that's unique to games and that's important for how you experience the music. It's not just like a static composition that every single person hears the same way. When you play Legend of Zelda, you're going to hear the soundtrack differently than when you play it, and then when you play it, because you're going to be spending different amounts of time in different areas, you're going to be fighting different monsters, you're going to be hurting different amounts of times, and that's all going to impact how you receive the score. And we really don't have the tools or the language for studying that, just with specifically with these types of techniques, which I'm hoping to fix. So that gets into kind of what I've been working on. So I've been like taking these techniques and trying to apply them specifically to video games. And then the emotions that I'm specifically interested in are immersion and flow. So how many of you have heard a game described as immersive as like a marketing buzzword trying to get you to buy it? How's that worked? No? Do you like what do people think of that term? Do they like it? Do they not like it?
I like it.
Why?
I like it because to me, immersion is I am solely focused on what I'm doing, nothing else. So if you can do that in a game, I think that's a good game.
Okay. Yeah.
I would say like, you kind of hit me on how to say like, when it became a buzzword, it kind of rubbed me the wrong way when I see it as like a marketing thing. But I will say like when I'm fully into a game to the point where like, especially something like RPG, where like I'm so into it that like the decisions feel real. Like, I've had moments where I'm so immersed in the game that like when like a really, really, really tough choice comes up, I like stop and I just think, and I put like a lot of thought into it, like it has a lot of stakes when I know it doesn't. And I could just save it and see what happens at the other end. But like when you're immersed like that, it feels like there's stakes. So I do like it as a whole.
Yeah.
As a word, it kind of is like a plus.
So the consensus for folks in the back who may not have heard is that it's annoying as a buzzword, but as an intrinsic quality, if you can even say that a game could have that as an intrinsic quality, it is desirable. It is a reason why a lot of people choose to play games, is to become immersed in some kind of virtual world. And that seems to be kind of the consensus when you look online. That seems to be kind of how people respond to the term. And there's also just this kind of annoyance that it's overused to the point that it is meaningless. Like if you tell me a game is immersive, it's like, okay, is it a VR game? Does it have good graphics? Is it going to ruin my life because I'm not going to be able to stop playing it? Like yes, no, all of the above. Like what does that mean for me as a consumer and as a player of games? And the great thing is that no one knows, or rather, no one agrees. It's like obscenity. It's like you can't necessarily define it, but you know it when you see it. Just kind of reviewing journalism and academic literature around this term in a game context, that's the conclusion that I have drawn, is that, again, people kind of dance around the term, but no one has like a concrete, agreed upon definition of what it actually means. So there's some ideas, some that I really like and some that I have some issues with. One that I like is based on a paper by Boyle et al. in 2012, and they didn't describe these categories explicitly, but kind of reading the paper, you get the idea that immersion comes in kind of four types or four flavors. There's narrative engagement, where you're really, really invested in the story of the game. So RPGs are a really classic example of this. Like you care about the characters, you want to know what happens next. If you are a reader and you read a book, this is a book that you can't put it down because I want to know what happens next. Then there's social presence. So this is where you're hanging out with your friends and you're having a good time and you're just really engaged in the conversation and the social activity. So if you play League of Legends with friends, or you play, Call of Duty with friends, or you play Fortnite with friends, and the reason you play the game is not something like the game's kind of whatever, like you enjoy it, but the reason that you play is to hang out with your friends, then it's delivering on this kind of social presence or social engagement. Then there's spatial presence, and this is when you feel like you've been transported to a virtual world. The world itself feels like a real place. It could be like cartoony, it could be, like Minecraft where everything's blocks, but it's still like it has its own internal logic and you feel like you are there when you are playing, and that kind of fantasy of being transported into another realm is why you play. And then finally there's flow. And then this is when you're engaged in the task that you're doing, really immersed in whatever the activity is. So the mechanics of driving in Mario Kart or Grand Theft Auto, of combat in League of Legends or Call of Duty or whatever game, whatever you're doing, that activity itself is the thing that you're really immersed in. Not necessarily the world or the people, but the physical mechanics. And of those four, flow is kind of unique to games. Like TV, you can't really have that. Movies, you can't really have that. Books, maybe a little bit, because it asks a little bit more of you. But flow, in order for something to deliver on flow, you have to be putting something into the activity. You can't, passive media don't deliver on this type of immersion or type of engagement. Only active media do. So I think from a psychological perspective, studying games and flow and how they get you in the zone, I think is really interesting, and so interesting that I've chosen to spend a PhD talking about it. So the guy who really came up with this idea, the guy's name is Senta Mahali, and I've had to say it many times. It was very scary the first time, but he was the psychologist who came up with this idea that flow, this idea of being in the zone, was a distinct psychological state, and he likened it to a kind of religious ecstasy. And when he was first writing about it, kind of the activities that he mentioned that are most likely to induce it, or that people most commonly report experiencing flow when they're doing these activities, are things like playing sports, playing a musical instrument, or playing games. And he was writing in the 90s, so like video games obviously existed, but they weren't, the culture around them wasn't as mainstream as it is today. So when he was talking about games, he was talking about things like chess or checkers, like board games, basically. So one of the, like usually when this term is discussed within the context of games, it's talked about within the context of difficulty, and how difficult you should make your game. And when you're tuning it, striking this balance between challenge and skill. So in order for someone to be in a state of flow, the thing that they're doing has to be challenging enough that they have to exert some effort in order to accomplish it, but then their skills have to match it. If it's too hard, they'll get anxious or frustrated or worried, but if the thing is too easy, they'll get bored or feel, apathetic. So, you'll hear this term like the difficulty curve, and tuning it finally so that you keep players in this flow state for as long as possible whenever you're designing a game. But that's really just one component of flow. It's an important one, but there's a lot of other stuff that is part of it as well. And these two psychologists, Jackson and Marsh, outlined 9 points. So one component is unambiguous feedback. So if you're doing something, you need to know how well you're doing at it. If you aren't sure, then you're kind of like, oh, am I doing the right thing? I don't know, and that is not conducive to getting in the zone. You'd have clear goals. You can't just be floundering around not knowing what you're doing. Action awareness merging, that basically means you act automatically. You act without thinking. It's a reflex. It's instinctive. You don't have to, you're not even aware that you are making the action. You just do it. Concentration, super duper focus, that's self-explanatory. Transformation of time, this one is really interesting and really fun. So it's this idea that the way that time seems to flow around you changes. So either things will look like they're moving in slow motion, or you won't realize, so that's an example of it slowing down, but it can also speed up. Like you could, in my example, it's like you play for hours and hours and hours, and you don't realize how much time has gone by, and then you look at your watch and you're like, oh crap, it's 3 in the morning, I need to go to bed. So both, transformation of time is really interesting because it can both slow down or speed up. Loss of self-consciousness. Basically, you're not worried about like embarrassing yourself anymore. This is a little bit related to concentration and action awareness merging. Kind of the external world will also seem to fall away. Sense of control. That's also self-explanatory. Basically, you just need to feel like you're in control of what you're doing. And then the autotelic experience. So this means that whatever it is you're doing it for the sake, like you like doing it. You're doing the action because of the pleasure of the action in and of itself, and it's not tied to some external reward. So like, I have to code, like write computer code as part of my coursework. And sometimes I like it, sometimes I think it's fun, and I can really get in the zone as a result of that. But if I have to write it because my advisor is making me, or there's an assignment, and that's kind of the main motivation, then it's harder for me to get in the zone. It's just like, oh, I have to do this because I'm going to get punished. Or it's like, you might like your job, and you might like parts of it, but at the end of the day, you're doing it to make money, not necessarily because you love it all the time. So that's the autotelic experience. You do the thing because you like doing it, not because it's tied to some reward. Kind of an interesting distinction is that these things at the top are conditions for flow. So these are things that like you as like a game designer, if you're a game designer, might have more control over in terms of like creating an environment that's conducive to flow. And then these other 6 things are internal psychological states that people experience as they're playing. So, the top row is something you might measure an activity about, and then the other 6 are things that you might measure in a person or in their experience. But again, a lot of the focus is just on challenge skill balance, which is kind of sad because there's a lot that can go into it. So what did Csikszentmihalyi, the guy who came up with this idea, say about games? This is a quote that I think is very interesting. It's easy to enter flow in games such as chess, tennis, or poker because they have goals and rule for action. For the duration of the game, the player lives in a self-contained universe where everything is black and white. So he's very big on, there has to be a clear goal in whatever it is you're doing. But I kind of disagree because I've played a lot of games where I've been able to get into the zone and that hasn't really been the case. So you look at games like Animal Crossing or Minecraft, depending on how you play those games, they don't give you a goal or a requirement of things to do. And clearly, even if they did, the people who made these screenshots ignored them because no one told anybody to make Diagon Alley in Animal Crossing. No one told anyone, the game developer didn't tell anyone to make Notre Dame in Minecraft. That's just something that someone did because they thought it was cool and they wanted to do it. There are also games like The Sims, one of the longest selling franchises of all time. It's just like, hang out with your Sims, make them happy. I don't care how, just do it. And then this is a little different because this one has some goals, but Breath of the Wild is another one that comes to mind. It's just one of my favorite games. And it's one that comes up a lot in terms of what's a game that really got you in the zone? Breath of the Wild. And part of the reason that people seem to like Breath of the Wild is because it is so freeform. You can do whatever you want. It gives you a quest, but you don't have to adhere to it if you don't want to. And so I think that Csikszentmihalyi was wrong. I think goal-oriented games have their place for flow, but games with broad or interpretable goals encourage players to set their own objectives, their own goals, and thus facilitate a more autotelic experience. You're doing something because you actually want to do it, not because game overlord is forcing you or telling you to. But no one's really talking about this, and I think it deserves study and examination. So, there's lots of ways to go about measuring flow. Lots of people have tried to come up with what's happening in your body or what's happening in your brain when you're experiencing flow. And there've been, I won't spend too much time on this because the results are kind of mixed, honestly. EMG is measuring electricity in your face muscles. EEG is brain waves. Skin conductance is that frisson I mentioned earlier. And then your heart rate is just your pulse. Some studies have found that these things correlate to people reporting being in a flow state. Other studies have said that there is a weaker correlation between those things. So, and then for studies that have focused on flow, the relationship between flow and music in games specifically, most of them have just focused on, is the music on or off? Which kind of makes sense. If you want to test on a commercial game, that's really the only variable that you can manipulate without modding it. And again, the results for this are, they're contradictory conclusions. So people who played games in a lab, a lot of lab experiments suggest that yeah, of course, they design the game with the music on, and so people enjoy it more, they're more in the zone, they have more fun when the music's on. But when you ask people in the wild about their gaming habits, it's less consistent. People talk about oh, I like putting on my own music better, or oh, I don't have headphones and I don't want to disturb my roommate or my kids when they're sleeping. So again, what's the conclusion here? People seem to have different opinions. And then just kind of one area that's interesting that I just want to mention, because people have tried to look at the relationship between generative music and flow. So the music isn't necessarily explicitly written when the game is made. The game is writing the music kind of as you're playing it, or creating the music as you're playing it. And does that help facilitate flow? And again, the answer is they have not found a conclusion that says yes, but also the generative music algorithms were not very sophisticated, so that might also be part of it. So I just want to wrap up here, got about 10, 15 minutes left, talking about some of the work that I've been working on to try to understand and unpack these questions and stuff that I plan on doing in the future. So this first study was what I did for my master's project. I was interested in the specific research questions of how can specific musical features, sound design practices, I didn't do sound design, or I did a little bit, or composition techniques facilitate flow experiences, and to what extent does giving the player an explicit goal versus letting them do, or basically telling them to do whatever they want, affect their ability to enter a flow state. So basically, I had a colleague who helped with this project. We built, it was not an open world because it was very, very short and we're not professional game developers. Kind of like, the main motivation was like, I want to get better at Unity so I can like get a job. And then we built an experiment kind of around that goal. So we made a short open world game that kind of had 4 distinct areas. There was like a hub area and then like 3 levels off to the side that we asked people to play. And then after 20 minutes, the game just shut off and we asked them some questions about their experience. We used music from the Pathless. I saw Awesome Winter. I was terrified he was going to show up. I'm glad he did. But basically, we wanted to pick music that we knew was associated with a game that people report. Oh, I experienced flow when I played this game. And it won a lot of awards. So we knew music was good. And then we found some studies or some papers that said this is a good questionnaire that you can use to accurately measure how in the zone people are whenever they're playing a game or whenever they're doing like any kind of activity and you're curious about that. So we administered those questionnaires and then also just asked them, how long do you think you played, to try to gauge that transformation of time element that I talked about earlier. So my colleague, his experiment was focusing on the loop length. So we took music and game music repeats over and over again. So some people got like a 15-second clip that repeated over and over again. Others got a 2.5-minute clip. And then the second experiment, we combined the goal versus non-goal prompt, and then also the types of musical transitions. So as you move from one area to the next, you would either crossfade seamlessly between background tracks, or like each place was separated by a hallway. So basically, the other condition was if you're in the hallway, you got silence, and then the music didn't come in until you were in the area properly. So our hypotheses were people who heard the long loops would score higher on the flow questionnaires versus people who heard the short ones. Not getting a goal would also be more conducive to flow, and getting that silence in the hallway would be more conducive to flow. And then all of these people would also estimate that there'd be lower, they played for less time than they actually did. So I can show a little bit of the gameplay demo. I'm a little short on time. We used a lot of assets from Unity because, again, we are not professionals. We learned a lot, but all of these are free, except for, so this was like a platforming challenge that we made, and this was like a combat one. So these, so basically our results, we didn't have a lot of people, so we didn't get a lot of statistical significance on a lot of these results. Just want to bear that in mind. But for the estimated playtime, everybody measured, there wasn't really a significant difference between any of the groups. Everyone consistently measured that it was less time than it actually was. Most people thought they played about 15 minutes when they actually played 20. Except for the people who heard the really, really short loops that repeated after 15 seconds. And reading like the free response comments from people who were given that build of the game, a lot of them were like, oh, I'm so annoyed, like the music got on my nerves, I hated this. And so I don't know, I guess it made them feel like they were just like trapped in some kind of, maybe not that extreme, but I thought that was interesting. And actually, yeah, so that was kind of cool. So that supported the hypothesis that we came up with. As for the game experience, a lot of these others, there wasn't a lot of statistical difference. With this game experience questionnaire, there really wasn't any statistical difference. And then for the short flow state scale was just another questionnaire. Everyone in this, basically the only thing of note here is this middle graph. Everyone who was in the silence transition, or in the silence condition, scored higher on this questionnaire in terms of like they had more flow than people who were in the crossfade condition, so that was also supportive of our hypothesis. And there are actually kind of three of those 9 dimensions that I mentioned, the clear goals, concentration, and the sense of control were statistically significant. So that was kind of interesting to see. Basically the main takeaways, the thing that I mentioned about difference in estimating the total playtime. But this was a very flawed study because we had a very small sample size. The gameplay was also like relatively complex. And our effects are very subtle. Again, with the exception of the loop length, you only got that prompt of what to do in the game for a few seconds at the beginning, and then everything else was the same. So there really wasn't that much difference between the experimental conditions, and so it's not surprising that there really wasn't that much difference in the results. And again, part of the reason we had a small sample was because just distributing this was hard. A lot of stuff was still happening remotely as we were doing this, so it was hard to get participants because it was download this massive game and then play it and then answer this questionnaire. And so a lot of people who were like, yeah, yes, do you have a question?
Are you planning on revisiting it then to see if you can get a larger sample size?
I would like to. I don't know if I would do it with this specific game. I would probably build something that I can post on a website somewhere and then direct people, go to this website, play the game, and then answer questions. And then I can also build things in the website to also collect data as they play, like track their score and stuff like that. So yeah, I do want to do more playtest studies. I just have to kind of rethink how I design them. So the thing that I'm working on right now, this will be really short because it's not finished yet, is a survey. So academics can be really annoying because there's a lot of arguing among academics between like, what is actually flow? What is actually immersion? They're different things. They're not the different things. And it's like, do you people actually play games? Like what? Like you read these papers and it's all very abstract and hoity-toity, which like is good that they're thinking about it, but I don't know, here's an idea. Let's ask people what they think and like do these definitions that people are positing in these papers of like, this is what immersion is, and because this is what it is, this is how you have to, like, does that hold up when you talk to people who touch grass? I'm currently running a survey to try to get some information on this, and it's by design. I'm supposed to be like really easy. You can do it in 15 minutes. And then ask you questions like, what are your favorite games? Why do you play? What kind of music do you like to listen to when you're not playing games? And then questions about, what games have you felt that make you feel really in the zone? What games do you think are really immersive? What does immersion mean to you? And I don't want to necessarily talk about how I'm going to analyze that because you guys can take this still. I'll put a link up at the end, and I don't want to bias you all more than I already have. But basically, I'm in the 3rd year of my PhD, so I've got about 2.5 to 3 years left. So some of the stuff that I'm planning on working on, again, going back to kind of the original playtesting approach, and just trying to manipulate additional musical effects. My advisor, when we were designing the study, was like, okay, you have to pick, because in music, like, if you change, the instrument, that's kind of a big thing to change. Like she made sure to like focus on one very specific thing that wouldn't necessarily interact with other elements of the music, which is why we chose loop length and like these types of transitions between soundtrack tracks. But I'd be interested in stuff like tempo, orchestration, harmonies, and then the thing on the guidebook said sound design. I haven't really explored sound design as a variable, but I think that's just as interesting and important, if not more so, than music. So how important are non-musical sounds, mixing considerations, and again, this gets really important, especially like with VR games, because it needs to simulate reality as much as possible. So then you're getting into things like, how do acoustic waves behave in a space, and how do our ears work to transform the sound waves that are bouncing all around the room, and then so that gets pretty complicated, and that's a whole other active area of research about like, okay, how close to reality do I have to make my simulation in order for people to buy that it's real? Because the closer it is to reality, the more expensive it is, the more memory it takes. So there are always trade-offs with these kinds of things, and kind of where is that optimal line? And then in terms of kind of like things on my to-do list for the next few weeks/months, got a lot of survey data to analyze, so looking forward to that. And then basically from that data, we're going to be like, okay, so also going back to this idea of like video game, or like a corpus of music, excuse me. You look up video game corpus, there really isn't anything. Film music corpus, there's all kinds of stuff, but they're really not in the format that I showed earlier. That doesn't exist published for video games. So I would like to publish that so that folks can do this kind of computational music analysis with that. So that, and then yeah, more playtesting experiments. This last one's kind of a longer term project goal. But special thanks to Ethan Lindblom. He's a fellow student who helped me make the game. Claire Arthur is my advisor. She's fantastic. And then I also consulted with some working sound designers, audio engineers who gave me recommendations on things to consider. Got a lot of references. So and, thank you all very much. This has been a lot of fun. I hope you enjoyed it. So I'm on Twitter. I don't tweet very often, but you can find me on Twitter. There, JF Mac. Oh, that's wrong. I'm going to change that. This is my Twitter. And my Instagram. You can also email me or go to my website. And then, yeah, that's the QR code for the survey if you are interested. And I timed that perfectly. We've got 12 minutes for questions. So happy to take any questions. Yes, you.
Just curious, I'm a data scientist. What's the name of the format that you use for the data corpus?
The question was, what's the name of the format that I used for the corpus? So this format here, so it's called Humdrum. It was created by this guy named David Huron at Ohio State. He worked at Ohio State University. He's retired now. And the goal behind, like, it was designed for like Western music, as kind of a lot of these tools are. But one thing that's nice about it is that it's basically just a TSV file that you put, like, you format metadata a certain way, you format musical data a certain way, but you can load it into other programs like a TSV. And you can, like these, so the top row here is like the header for the type of data that you're encoding. So kern just means like melody. Heart and harm are harmonic information, and then there's pedals, cadences in the music, and then just notes. But you can define whatever data you want. You can make up your own system, your own notation. And one of my colleagues who just graduated, she's from India, and she is studying Hindustani classical music. Thank you, in the back. So there's like a notation specifically for like Indian music, and she was analyzing those files for that. But the name is called Humdrum, Humdrum. You're welcome. Yes, in the orange.
So the loop length for the two different parts of your experiment, I find that interesting because I'm a sound designer for theater and video games and stuff too. So when I was learning it in school, we were always told that the minimum you work in is a 30-second loop because your brain, it takes that long for your brain to realize, okay, it's the loop, and then you stop hearing it after a certain point to get you to watch an hour. And I've always found that interesting because now when I play video games and everything, I won't pay attention to the music.
Really?
So I know that's not the case for everyone, but did you have any responses in your feedback about that type of thing, or was there just you didn't have enough people?
Well, I mean, the feedback was that they got annoyed because they're just like, why is this repeating over and over and over again? Ethan, you know, when he had gotten another master's degree before coming to Georgia Tech, and he wrote his master's thesis for that program specifically about loop lengths in Ocarina of Time. And basically this is like the length of the loop in that game helps communicate how long you're supposed to be in a specific place. So like Hyrule Field's over 5 minutes long, you spend a lot of time there. The theme for the shops, it's probably like 20 seconds long because you're not supposed to spend a lot of time there. And if you think about it, that's not only does that like communicate what you're supposed to do, but like that just makes sense from like a design perspective. It's like, why would I write 2 minutes of music for a place that people aren't going to spend more than 20 seconds in it? Like that's just a waste of time. So again, we put, and Claire was also like, you have to make the lengths as drastic as possible. This is the idea of like effect size. So she wanted one to be really, really short and one to be really, really long so that if there was an impact, we could see it really clearly. So that's kind of the main reason we chose the lengths that we did. But yeah, that's interesting. I've never heard that rule of 30 seconds, and that kind of makes sense for, that's interesting for theater. I don't know how much that holds up for video games specifically. I think, again, it like kind of depends on the context of.
Yeah, I mean, when I'm composing for video games, I tend to work in a longer chunk of time, but the idea of your brain is going to recognize like the loop after a certain point and you're not going to pay attention anymore. That's what you're really looking out for, to make sure your music has enough variant stuff in it.
Yes.
I don't know if you have the answer to this, but my understanding, I was just going back to some of the other studies you briefly talked about, when you talked about using EEGs to measure. My understanding of EEG was that it was typically used to cite epileptic activity. So how would that help with gathering?
Yeah, so we had a professor at Georgia Tech who has since left, but her whole thing was EEG studies and music. And the reason that EEGs are good for studying like what is happening like neurologically in your brain when you're listening to music as opposed to like an fMRI, is that the time resolution of an EEG is very, very small. So you can say like, oh, there was this spike in like delta wave activity in the EEG right when the symbol hit, and you can actually see that. Whereas the fMRI, you get a more detailed picture of like the region in your brain that's activating, but you don't get as strong of a temporal resolution to actually be able to match that with a specific musical feature. But again, the problem with it is that because like there's a trade-off, there's always these trade-offs, the spatial resolution is not as good because you are just seeing the electrical activity in the brain, and it's not telling you like, oh, like this. And again, I don't know as much about like the EEG. Like that's something that I'm actively. That's like a goal of mine this semester is to learn more about that type of stuff. Yes.
I look at the pupil dilation stuff. You know.
Yeah. We just got pupillometry equipment like this semester. Or last semester, I don't know. We got it a year ago, and we like learned how to use it like last semester. So yeah, we do. The thing about pupillometry, specifically with video games, is when you're doing a pupil. So the question was like measuring eye dilation. The challenge with using that in a video game study is that the main thing that affects how widely your pupils are dilating is how much light they're receiving. And a lot of those studies, it's like, okay, stare at this static screen with a crosshair that doesn't change throughout the duration of the study. And when you're playing a game, obviously, like, the screen is changing all the time. So it's very hard to map musical information to pupil dilation in a game context because there's so much other stuff happening. Yes?
I think one of the big things that separates like games from other forms of media in terms of trying to put the player in a sense of flow is a lot of games' use of adaptive music. I was curious if you had considered that as part of your experiment.
Yeah, that was kind of the initial like thing that I wanted to test, actually. And I mean, this game does like technically have an adaptive soundtrack. Like the music changes based on where you are, so it's like by the very basic definition of it like that, it qualifies. But yeah, it's not as like robust. So yeah, like that is something that other people are looking at and that I would like to look at. But again, like at least for this experiment, my advisor pushed us to be like, change like the tempo or change like an instrument, like clarinet versus piano. Once you're saying like, oh, I'm gonna have an adaptive versus non-adaptive soundtrack, you're kind of, that just by its nature requires you to tweak more elements of the music than just like one thing. And then it's a little bit harder for you to pinpoint like, okay, well, what specific adaptive feature was the key thing? I think that is an important study and is something that I might do at some point. And I'm sure, another thing that's frustrating is that I'm sure that there are like companies know the answers to a lot of these questions and have data on a lot of these questions. They're just not published in scientific papers for independent developers or students to know the answers to. So that's kind of another big motivation for this, is that I would like to try to democratize this information. Yeah, exactly. And like that's also why I'm here. Like if you know the answers to these and like want to chat with me, like please hit me up. Like love to get more contacts. But yes, you had a question.
So I was wondering, you had said during your experiment that one of your hypotheses was that the music having a break, like in the hallways between the rooms, would increase their flow score. And I was just wondering if you could kind of like walk me through why that case, because I would think the opposite.
Yeah. The faculty asked me that same question when I presented this. It goes back to this idea of feedback. So you're basically giving more information to the player that something is changing. So I don't know. Again, this is like, the effect was not very strong. So like you could make an argument either way. But basically you're giving, sorry, I can't take any more questions. I just got the wrap it up sign. But basically, you're giving them information at 2 points in time versus just 1 point in time. So it's like you're leaving one area and entering another area versus just like something new is happening. So it's kind of like less surprising when the music changes because they're kind of already primed to expect something new. That was my rationale behind that. Well, thank you all so much. This was a lot of fun. I'm gonna hang around, so if you want to keep chatting. And again, if you have ideas or knowledge, I'd love to get in touch with people because I've got a lot more experiments planned, but want to make sure I'm doing them correctly. So thank you all so much and have a great rest of your MAGFest.